Hello and welcome to this podcast from the BBC World Service. Please let us know what you think and tell other people about us on social media. Podcasts from the BBC World Service are supported by advertising.
Thank you for downloading Business Matters from the BBC World Service. 50 minutes of interviews and discussion on the day's big news stories and themes from Asia, America and across the globe.
It's midnight GMT. Hello, I'm Rahul Tandon, and this, of course, is Business Matters here on the BBC World Service. We are, as usual, connecting those time zones, and today we're live in Silicon Valley and Tokyo. As Jack Dorsey splashes the cash, we look at the booming world of buy now, pay later online.
They stumbled on a real revelation with just a simple model of breaking your payment up into 4 over 60 days. And it really took off.
We head to Tokyo to talk about the Olympics and ask, have the Japanese changed their minds about the Games? Initially, they wanted them cancelled, so with Japan flying up the medal table, are they now fans? And move over Burbank, here comes Broxbourne, why a slice of Hollywood is heading to Hertfordshire in southern England. That's all coming up on the programme. Business Matters as usual. But first, let's get the very latest BBC News.
Hello, I'm Chris Barrow with the BBC News. A doctor in Lashkar says days of intense fighting have brought the southern Afghan city to its knees, with most people now too scared to move. Dr Masood Khan of Médecins Sans Frontières said a growing flow of severely wounded patients was arriving at his hospital, and he feared that others were unable to reach it. US planes are attacking Taliban positions. The militants are also trying to seize Afghanistan's second largest city, Kandahar, where Pashtana Durrani heads an education charity.
I have cried my eyes out so much because it's all shelling, bombing all night long. In the morning, all you see is stray bullets in your backyard, front yard. Every time you look at your phone, someone in your family is dead. Someone in your district is dead. Someone you knew is dead. Someone you knew is fleeing the country. Someone you knew is fleeing the province. So that's literally living a nightmare.
The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken says there'll be significant challenges for a new refugee program for Afghans vulnerable to Taliban retribution because their work assisted the US. Applicants will have to leave Afghanistan before they can apply, and screening of them could take a year to 14 months. 18 of Brazil's most senior judges have rejected the latest claims from President Bolsonaro that the country's electronic voting system is open to fraud. They said no such fraud had ever been documented. Alex Ritson reports.
The statement by the judges is unprecedented and comes after a string of attacks on the electronic voting system by the president and his supporters. He's accused the Supreme Court Justice Luis Roberto Barroso of wanting elections to be manipulated and also suggested he might not accept the result of next year's presidential election if the system isn't changed. But Mr. Bolsonaro hasn't provided any evidence for his claims. The judges say the electronic system is far safer than paper ballots and that it has eliminated a history of election fraud.
Palestinian families facing eviction from their homes in a neighbourhood in East Jerusalem, Sheikh Jarrah, say they'll reject a suggestion by the Supreme Court of Israel that they rent their properties from a Jewish settler organisation. The settlers claim old rights to the land. The possible compromise, raised at an inconclusive court hearing, would make the Palestinian families protected tenants. They want recognition of their rights to the properties. Tom Bateman is in Jerusalem.
For the Palestinians, they are living in occupied territory. They don't recognise the Israeli legal system. This wasn't conducted in their first language, Arabic. There was no official translation from Hebrew. And for them, it is part of them having to live under a system of occupation where they don't have the same civil and political rights as Israeli citizens.
This is the latest world news from the BBC.
Hello and welcome to Business Matters. I'm Rahul Tandon in our studio in central London. I'll be joined throughout the programme by two guests on opposite sides of the world. Our very own gold medalist. We have Alison von Diglen, head of the Fresh Dialogues interview series, who's in California. How are you, Alison?
I'm very well, Rahul. I'm laughing at the idea of me having gold medals.
Well, I'm sure it's possible. We'll be giving you the Business Matters one, I'm sure, as always, at the end of the programme. And also we have Peter Landers, who is from the Wall Street Journal in Tokyo, who I imagine, Peter, you've always pretty busy, but even more busy over the last week or so.
That's right. We do have great support from our sports team. We haven't had any journalists from outside Japan visit this country for a year and a half, except as of a week and a half ago. We have a whole great team of sports editors and writers, mostly from New York, who are leading the coverage.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. I like Peter there. I wish our editors were as full of praise for their colleagues as Peter was there. Let's start with our top story now. We pay for something now. Why pay for something now, even when you could pay for it later? For centuries, that was the logic behind the idea of credit, but it's also the logic behind a whole new generation of businesses offering finance for shopping online. Here, for example, is a flavour of a TV ad for the Australian firm Afterpay, known as ClearPay here in Europe. It features the actress Rebel Wilson as an assistant in a clothes store.
Cash credit or Afterpay?
What's Afterpay?
Well, it's kind of like having the abs now, but getting 6 weeks to do the sit-ups. If credit cards and cash had a baby, you could pay over time without ever paying interest. If you could eat the whole tub of ice cream and spread the calories...
You get the idea from that, don't you? Have what you want now, but pay in installments over a short period of time. Sounds pretty good. Whilst there's no interest, there are fees for late payments. Companies like Afterpay also make their money by charging retailers to offer the service. Other big names in the world of buy now, pay later include Sweden's Klarna and PayPal. Their business has boomed in the pandemic era, and Twitter's founder and chief executive, Jack Dorsey, well, he wants a piece of that action. He also owns a digital payments company called Square. Now Square has agreed to buy Afterpay for $29 billion. Jonathan Shapiro is a writer for the Australian Financial Review. He's co-author of a book all about the growth of Afterpay, and he's been speaking to Mike Johnson about why Jack Dorsey finds it so attractive.
Square's probably like a leader in like a new cohort of finance companies that are focused on payments. It requires a transaction between a consumer, a customer who makes the payment, and a merchant or a retailer who sells the goods. And Square has always actually been quite strong on servicing retailers. And then it's also got all these apps and electronic kind of wallet for customers, for consumers, for spenders. So the trick is to bring them together and kind of integrate them so it's more seamless. And that's something that Afterpay, an Australian company, has done really well. It's kind of integrated and connected merchants with customers. So we think that's what Jack Dorsey is playing at. We think he wants to acquire Afterpay's expertise of kind of greasing the wheels of its ecosystem with that secret sauce of connecting, better integrating and connecting customers with merchants. Afterpay is quite an incredible company. It didn't exist 5 years ago. What Afterpay did, it came up with a simple idea of just saying, look, if you want to buy something like a pair of jeans, you just split it into 4 payments. And we will advance the funds to the shop where you buy your jeans from, and the shop will pay us 4% because they will regard that as a lead generation, as a sale that they couldn't have done by themselves because you didn't have the money or you were undecided, and the fact that Afterpay was going to stump up the funds for you got you over the line. So merchants found that 4% fee was worth it. A lot of early retailers that tried it were getting 20-30% jump in sales, and they were also finding that the customers were buying, instead of a pair of shoes, they were maybe buying 2 pairs of shoes, or they were spending more. Their basket sizes were going up. So it was they stumbled on a real revelation with just a simple model of breaking your payment up into 4 over 60 days. And it really took off. I mean, the growth was tremendous. Companies like Klarna and Affirm and PayPal that were doing payments before them, some versions of lending, realizing that, wow, like this is a really powerful device for a payments company to grow merchants and customers and transaction volume. So, yeah, it's a simple idea that's now grown into what is now a $30 billion company.
Alison, some of those most simple ideas are the ones that generate the most amount of money. We heard from Jonathan Shapiro there, and this makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Much easier to use, much less interest, well, none at all really if you pay on time, than credit cards.
Yes, but I think the naysayer in me is saying it's basically just a credit card in this sexy new fintech sheep's clothing. It's possibly going to induce more people who can't afford it to, buy that second pair of Nikes or, the new iPhone or whatever it is. And so it's the naysayer in me is saying, this is just going to contribute to another subprime credit crisis.
Peter, what about the Japanese? Are they keen to pick up on this? Are we seeing it being introduced in Japan in the same way that we're seeing it in Europe and the US?
Not at all. And I think there are big cultural differences in how people use credit and what do they pay with credit cards. It's one of the biggest differences I see just between the U.S., my home country, and Japan. In the U.S., just, the credit card industry is huge. People think nothing of buying a car that's bigger than they can afford and hoping that somehow they'll figure out how to deal with the lease payments. And if they don't, maybe it'll get repossessed. Of course, the subprime lending crisis was partly induced, I guess you might say, by people trying to buy more house than they could afford. And banks in that time, of course, the financial industry was very much invested in trying to get them to do that. Whereas in Japan, I guess people are just more cautious. There's much less spending on credit, and apps like these have not taken off yet.
Is that changing, Peter? Because when I was in India, there was a very similar attitude to the Japanese one. But with the younger generation, that began to change a little bit. They were more keen to look at credit. Is that happening in Japan at all with the younger generation?
I don't see it yet, but it could. And of course, everyone in the younger generation does have a phone. They're used to doing so many things with their phone, whether it be social media, talking to their friends, of course, everything is on the phone. So if you can introduce a very easy to use, simple to understand app like Afterpay has done, it could eventually take off in Japan, I would say.
Alison, it's interesting you mentioned trainers before, because actually my daughter used this today. Well, I used it for her. I was really hoping for a more buy never attitude from her when it came to shoes, but I think we're a bit late there. It is more equitable, though, isn't it, for youngsters who may not have that cash, that it gives them an option to buy things that they may need, and that's good for the economy as well.
Yes, I think that's a very important point. I mean, consumer spending in the US accounts for 2/3 of the US GDP. So, it is a big driver. And of course, the merchants are delighted because, I think the reporter said, 20 to 30% jump in sales as a result of this. So it's a wonderful lead generator. But the mother in me is saying, yes, what is it going to do for kids that don't understand? They want that item because they just saw it on their Instagram account. And, they don't really have the cash to pay for it. So that is a worry.
I share your pain. Believe me, I do, as the father of 2 children. I wonder, Peter, the point that Alison makes there, though, is an important one. But isn't this about wherever we are in the world, in an education system now, should we not be teaching kids more about how to manage their finances along with the education that they're having?
Absolutely. It's very important. And if you think that if you've looked at your finances and you think you have the money to make those 4 payments, then by all means buy it now and pay for it over 4 installments. It's just the psychology of it that young people may not understand and maybe do need to be taught in school. These instant fulfillments or instant wish fulfillments that some of these apps may represent probably needs to be discussed and students need to understand.
Last word to you, Alison, on this very quickly. The fact that Jack Dorsey's spending so much money on Afterpay shows you, though, that this is going to grow and grow and grow, probably.
Absolutely. I think the Financial Times summed it up really well. They said he's buying it now so that he doesn't have to pay later for his mistake. He's missed out on this, on this sector that's been it's tripled in size in the last year.
Yeah, it's incredible. I wonder if Jack Dorsey bought it now and paid a little bit later. I'm sure we'll find out. Maybe we never will. We're going to turn to the Olympics now. Now, before the Games, we covered it extensively here on the BBC World Service and on Business Matters. There were many polls in the Japanese media. Some seem to be showing that almost 80% of the nation's population did not want the Games to go ahead. Here's what some Japanese members of the public told the BBC ahead of the Games.
I'm worried about having the Games in the current situation.
If they are just watching the Games, there is no problem. But they are bound to go to restaurants and bars afterward. So I'm worried about the infection spreading.
Peter, we have these spectator-free games. Intrigued to hear from you. Do you think the Japanese public have changed their opinion on the Games now that they're taking place and Japan's doing so well?
I think there has been some improvement in the public mood about the Olympics. After all, Japan has won 17 gold medals, which is a new record for the country, and we still have a few more days to go. So naturally, people feel a little bit of patriotism, and they want to celebrate the athletes' achievements. Most of them are watching at home, and the ratings have been fairly good for the Olympics, including the opening ceremony, which was watched by 56% of households, nearly a record. So the mood has improved somewhat, but I think a recent poll suggests that perhaps slightly more than half of Japanese still wish the Games had not happened.
Is that because of COVID? Is it also to do with the fact that it costs so much, and that cost obviously goes up when you don't have spectators inside the stadia as well?
I think it's mainly the COVID situation, and Japan has, like many countries with the Delta variant, experienced a surge in cases. We have had more than 10,000 every day for the past few days nationwide. Tokyo had more than 4,000 new cases over the weekend. So it's just a concern that with all of these athletes and others in Japan, maybe about 50,000 people total or slightly less, that this will inevitably lead to further infections, although I don't think it probably has yet.
It's a strange situation, though, isn't it, Peter? Because I was looking at a piece, something that you posted on your Twitter account. You've been to a sporting event which has had spectators, about 5,000, but it's not the Olympics, but it took place at the same time.
That's right. The high school baseball tournament is going on in Japan right now. That is a true nationwide obsession, baseball here. And the high school teams from each of the 47 prefectures ultimately compete near Osaka for the championship, and the whole nation is glued to the TV at that point. Right now, we're in the stage where each prefecture is choosing its team to compete in that national championship. And so I went to a game at Tokyo Dome between a couple of Tokyo high schools, and they did allow up to 5,000 spectators. I felt safe there. Everybody is wearing a mask. People were told not to cheer with their voices. They can clap and so on. And so it seemed like, well, if we were having the Olympics and doing that same kind of thing, maybe it would have been okay. But I guess it's too late for that now.
Yeah, maybe a little bit. Alison, you got the Olympics coming to California, haven't you, after Paris?
That's right.
But I suppose you have an infrastructure there because you've had it before. Does that help? Does that mean that people don't worry about the costs of it? Because it is a concern for many cities that host it.
Oh, there's a lot of controversy about the cost of it. Yes, LA will be hosting the Olympics in 2028, and it's actually famous as a host city for hosting it in 1984, and they actually are the only host city that's made a direct profit from the Games. And the reason, as you say, is because the infrastructure was already there. They had the Rose Bowl, they had a lot of really big stadiums, and they were ready to host, and that's really still the same. But there are a lot of ancillary costs that will be involved. And so it's always controversial because some people, even though the Olympics is, open to everyone, some people see it as an elitist thing. And so it will be interesting to see if they can pull it off.
Let's turn to another aspect of the Olympics that people are going to be talking about on Tuesday, because a lot of eyes are going to be on the American gymnast Simone Biles. She'll compete in the women's beam final after withdrawing from her other events for mental health reasons. Lots of discussion about that. The sports psychologist Amanda Owens, who's a former member of the British Olympic Association's Psychology Advisory Panel, says Biles should be applauded for being open about her mental health. She says athletes taking part in the Tokyo Games are under extra pressures.
The athletes have had to deal with, on top of their training and other variables and pressures, the COVID anxiety and COVID impacts on their training. And indeed, the COVID anxiety in the Olympic Village, which has been incredibly well managed, but it still exists. So I think to criticise athletes at this level is just out of order, and really, people need to understand the amount of pressure and stress.
Alison, it's going to be an incredible moment when Simone Biles takes part on the women's beam. I know it's been a huge topic of conversation in the US. Many people will be watching that event. I'm sure of those conversations continuing about the decisions she's taken.
Yes, indeed. I mean, I personally applaud Simone Biles for having the courage to step back and shine a light on the importance of mental health. I think she has said repeatedly, put your mental health first. And I think that really applies whether you're an Olympic athlete, you know, facing the vault or the balance beam, or even a small business entrepreneur. If your head is not in the game, you know, disastrous things could happen, and you know, your dreams could unravel. And I think Peter was talking about mindsets in Asia, in Japan. I think the mindset in the US is generally very open to talking about mental health, you know, mental illness. Seeing a therapist doesn't label you here as, you know, someone kind of abnormal. It's very normal here to see a therapist and talk about, you know, needing me time or fill up your well, or, you know, this kind of thing, and more balance.
Peter, I'm fascinated to get the way that the Japan reacted to Naomi Osaka when she pulled out of the French Open. Was it a similar reaction? Is there such a debate about mental health in Japan?
I think less so, and there is maybe still more of the idea that you know, your country is watching you, and you can't let down the team or your fans by not appearing in the games. Although I think it is very healthy for Simone Biles to make that put that stress on mental health and point to the risk of her competing when she is feeling that she may injure herself. Even you know, gymnasts have broken their necks by falling in the wrong way, and so if she's not feeling comfortable, clearly it's the right move. I would say Japan hasn't quite gotten there yet.
Well, the whole world will be watching Simone Biles when she does take to the centre stage in the gymnastics later on Tuesday. Peter, one question I wanted to ask you, because what we've seen is a lot of new sports to get that younger audience. You know, the whole world of business needs to bring in younger people to keep buying their products. The Olympics no different from that. We've got the climbing taking place for the first time in the Olympics. That happens on Tuesday as well. Skateboarding's been a big success. But what do the Japanese make of skateboarding? Do they like it? Do they see it as a sport that maybe shouldn't be there?
It was a reporter at Reuters, Mari Saito, here in Tokyo, who pointed out that even after a Japanese competitor, Yuto Horigome, won the gold medal in skateboarding, that there were signs posted very near the location of the competition saying no skateboarding.
Really?
Yes. That
Fortunately, not in the competition.
Yeah, that's right. That's right, but very nearby in an area of Tokyo that does have broad streets and parks and places where a skateboarder would naturally feel inclined to take to the streets. There are clear signs saying don't do it. And I
Why
hear
is
from
that?
Well, I guess it's just considered, Japanese use the word meiwaku, just a nuisance to everyone else, and it could cause injury. So I think obviously there needs to be a balance, and skateboarders themselves need to be protected from traps that or other places that they might get injured skateboarding. But perhaps the gold medal and other events at the Olympics will encourage Japan to create the spaces where skateboarders can skate safely.
Yeah, Alison, don't take your skateboard to Tokyo when you can travel there. Travel there again. We have the track and field, and I want to end this conversation with you, Alison, because we've seen these searing temperatures in Tokyo. A reminder of some of the changes that we're seeing, that you're seeing as well in California.
Yes, indeed. Temperatures here are up 2% compared to the 1950s, and we have an added issue of drought, the worst drought since 1977. In fact, a commentator said our 4 seasons here in California are now fire, flood, earthquake, and drought. It's quite apocalyptic sometimes.
It is not maybe the best way to end this half hour. Would that be a concern for when the Olympics comes as well, about what the state of the climate could be for the athletes who are going to perform in LA?
Yes, but I think, especially in LA, they're used to warmer temperatures, and everywhere you go, I'm sure it will be air conditioned, when appropriate.
And Peter, has it been a challenge for the authorities, the temperatures?
Absolutely. Athletes have complained that tennis matches were moved to later in the afternoon. And the marathon, this is even predates the pandemic, the marathon competition will be held in Sapporo in northern Japan, hopefully to avoid the heat, although it can get quite hot up there as well.
There we go. Look at the Olympics. We took in many different aspects of it there. Continued coverage here on the World Service about who's going to win all those medals. Pretty good performance so far, I've got to say, from Peter and Alison. Gold medals going their way. Let's move to California now, because when you think of Hollywood, that's where you think it's based. And perhaps famous film sets like the Warner Brothers lot in Burbank, where this 2060 blockbuster was partly shot.
How are you going to be a revolutionary if you're such a traditionalist? You're holding on to the past, but jazz is about the future.
Maybe I'm not good enough.
Yes, you are.
Maybe I'm not. It's like a pipe dream.
This is the dream. It's conflict.
You can never have too much John Legend on the Business Matters. That, of course, is him in La La Land. Now, though, the brand behind that film, Sunset Studios in Los Angeles, is making its first expansion outside the United States. They plan to invest almost $1 billion, creating a major new film, television and digital production complex here in England, just over 25 kilometres north of London, in Broxburn, in Hertfordshire. James Seppala is head of Blackstone Real Estate Europe.
The UK film and TV industry, just to give you a sense, has grown at about 14% annually over the last 5 years. And so that's outperformed the UK economy more broadly by over 7 times. And from our discussions with a number of production companies, in regards to this scheme, the primary constraint, frankly, on even faster growth in the UK has been the lack of available stage capacity. And so, we're delighted to be helping to address that supply shortage with this facility at Broxburn.
Mike Johnson has been hearing more about the venture from Georg Salai, international business editor of The Hollywood Reporter.
There's been a production boom in the last 3 years in the UK. We've seen growing appetite for content, especially original content, by all the streaming services that have been rolling out. It's both interest in globally appealing content, but also regional or local content. The UK has such a strong creative community, both in terms of writers, but also directors and actors, that a lot of people want to come here to produce. What you've seen is a shortage of production spaces in the UK. And so everybody has been hunting for new locations. We've sometimes in the last few years seen people produce movies or shows in like airplane hangars or, factories that have not been in use anymore. So there's been this competition. And so that's why there's an interest and an appetite to create new locations where things can be shot. And the fact that it's close to London, in the vicinity of London, is usually seen as appealing because it's a place that people can travel in and out of quite easily.
These are 2 American companies. I imagine everything you've just said could be as easily said about Hollywood, or perhaps not. Does the UK have pluses that Hollywood doesn't?
I think to some degree, when people from Hollywood look abroad, the UK is often kind of the first address they turn to, because they say, oh, these are people who have a somewhat different tone or voice than we're used to from Hollywood, but they all kind of, come together in the UK, and people like to travel into the UK, even if they're maybe based in Germany or France. Brexit might make that a little trickier, but it's kind of seen as a big hub outside of Hollywood.
Do you see streaming and the big budgets that companies like Netflix have as a big driver behind this move?
One of the big drivers behind the production boom in the UK has definitely been the growing appetite of streaming companies, both the global ones, like Netflix or Amazon, Disney Plus, etc. But you've also seen companies look for regionalized content. And so sometimes if you're looking for something that's maybe slightly different from what you're used to, you look for something locally produced, and UK content is sometimes seen as kind of the first thing that you add on as an American company, and then you move maybe into other markets, maybe then you move into France or Asian markets. And so that's all been driving this huge growth in demand in the last few years here in the UK.
Now that some lockdowns in some places are coming to an end, do you think perhaps the huge growth in streaming may tail off and therefore may make investments like these slightly more questionable when it comes to making a return on those investments? And cinema in many places is struggling, isn't it?
You definitely see after the end of lockdowns, cinema slowly opening. There's still some delay in getting people back to what they hope will be normal behavior again after the end of the pandemic. I think you've seen a lot of delayed productions that are now trying to wrap up, and then companies looking to fill the pipeline that has been kind of hurt by production delays or closures during COVID. So the next couple of years, you'll see a lot of production activity. I think beyond that, the question will be, will a lot of the new studio spaces that will open up in a few years, will they be sustainable longer term, or will there at some point be a peak that we hit and suddenly, maybe we have too many of these locations across the country? I think that's something that people will keep a close eye on, but that's going to be a few years down the road.
Georg Salai there of The Hollywood Reporter. And just to say, this venture is still subject to UK planning permission, though the people behind it say they are hopeful they will get the green light, as it's likely to bring 4,500 permanent jobs to the area. Alison, do you think they're worried in Hollywood about this move to Hertfordshire? Could it be the beginning of a bigger trend?
I think I've got one answer, and that's weather. Hollywood is known for, or LA is known for very stable, sunshine every day, 70 degrees. So that is something that, other locations can't offer. But I think it's a wonderful opportunity for Britain. And I'm absolutely cheered to see, for example, the next Indiana Jones film is being filmed in Glasgow, my hometown. And I'm just hoping it stays dry and sunny enough for them to finish the shoot. But no, I think it's excellent. And, as the reporter said there, it's a pipeline issue. The pandemic has really forced Hollywood and all these art productions or producers to focus on what the consumer wants. And that's compelling, bingeable streaming services.
I didn't know they were doing another Indiana Jones film.
Yes, Harrison Ford is pacing the streets of Glasgow.
Really? Well, and of course the weather, you had to bring that into the conversation, Alison, didn't you? But he's getting the British summer, not as bad as some people think it is. Peter, I think what is important, and it's one thing that we've seen, haven't we, from the pandemic with companies like Netflix, etc. It's not just about this expanded market they have. It's about the fact that because they've been so successful, it brings more cash to these companies and allows them to grow more.
That's right. It's a real land grab for all of the streaming companies, including Netflix, Apple, and Amazon, and others. And I think there's going to be probably a shakeout in the industry in the next 5 to 10 years. So many new streaming services asking people to pay, let's say, $10 a month or €10 a month for content. And maybe you get Netflix and maybe you get one or two others, but you're not going to spend hundreds of dollars or the equivalent every month on 10 different services. You're going to pick a few, and I think a few winners will probably ultimately emerge from this free-for-all that we're seeing now. And the key is going to be great content, and content that everybody is talking about, and your friends are all watching, so you watch it too. And right now, for the streaming services, the risk is not that they might spend too much on a new production. The risk is that they would lose out in this land grab.
And in that land grab, internationally, does Japan feature in that? Are we seeing the streaming services, the big ones, your Netflixes, your Disney Pluses, your Amazon Primes, looking at that Japanese market, or is Japanese streaming mainly Japanese companies?
It is. They have entered the Japanese market, especially Netflix and Amazon Prime. We wrote about Netflix creating an anime studio for animated content made by Japanese producers, partly for the Japanese market and also for global markets. And so it's a little surprising because it's such a difficult market to break into. And of course, the language and the actors and the directors, it's just a completely different ecosystem for entertainment. And yet they're doing it, I think, because they want to have that global scale.
And are we seeing Japanese companies trying to take them on when it comes to these streaming services and production of content?
Not so far. In Japan, it's funny, the traditional broadcast networks are still very strong, and so they haven't really dived into that streaming business yet. They're still working with a sort of 20th century model of you go home, you turn on the television and watch a drama that's scheduled for 8 p.m. to 9 p.m. And you sell advertising against that. So they haven't really dived into the streaming business yet.
Alison, I can't get that image of Harrison Ford pacing the streets of Glasgow out of my head at the moment. But a quick last question to you on this one. I mean, how many streaming services do you have?
We have quite a number of them, in fact.
Because you lose count sometimes, don't you?
Pardon?
You lose count sometimes. I have no idea how many we have. A lot.
Yes. What I would say is because we are spending more time at home, and I still haven't been to the movies. It's been, 18 months to the movie theater, that, we feel compelled to, let's just sign up for that new Hulu series, and okay, we'll have to become Hulu members, etc. So we used to be very strict about it. One, we would do Netflix or HBO, and now we're like, to hell with it, because we're not spending that money on movie tickets. So I think that's compelling. The other issue is China's become the world's largest movie market last year, with $3 billion spent on tickets, almost $1 billion more than US and Canada. So I think that is definitely a driver too for the future.
It is, and for those of you who don't know, Hulu is a big American TV network. Let us turn to our final story. Some deride them as Frankenstein foods. For others, the technology behind genetic modification could help reduce malnutrition and address the impact of climate change. Some genetically modified organisms, or GMOs, first appeared in the 90s. They've been viewed with suspicion by many consumers and health authorities, especially in Europe. Ivana Davidovich reports now on whether new scientific developments will help to rehabilitate the image of genetic modification.
Hello, hi. Are you Kathy? Oh, very nice to meet you. How are you? I've travelled to the city of Norwich in England to meet with plant biologist and university professor Kathy Martin at the John Innes Centre where she works. Kathy spent decades researching how fortifying crops can improve diets and fight diseases globally. After 13 years, she's at the cusp of getting her genetically modified purple tomato approved in the US for sale directly to consumers, which would make them one of only a handful of fruits and vegetables to achieve that status.
Here we have what we call purple tomatoes, and these were the first ones that we produced. They basically have a pathway for making pigments, the anthocyanins, switched on in fruit. So normally in tomato fruit you don't have this pathway switched on. The switch that we've engineered in here, so you see these are nice and purple.
It almost looks like a plum inside. Yes. It is a bit plum-like.
Because it's a genetically modified organism, we have to get special regulatory oversight, and it looks as though we're almost at the end of that road.
How would you explain how you see at the moment the benefits of creating these sorts of fruits and vegetables?
We have shown in mouse studies consuming these as 10% of the diet by dry weight, they extend the lifespan of cancer-prone mice by 30%. I know it's only mice. Just by changing your diet, you can improve your prognosis.
And how did you create them?
The genes encoding the transcription factors came from snapdragon, garden snapdragon. Think about how much anthocyanins you would have to consume from a regular food. It would be equivalent to about 70 grams of blackberries a day for the rest of your life.
To give you what? This protection up to 30% against cancer.
Okay, so that's assuming that mouse data translates. But it's 2 tomatoes a day.
While scientists like Kathy Martin focus on improving diets and health outcomes, others are looking towards gene engineering in plants as one way of dealing with the worst effects of climate change.
Either you're having too much rain or you're having too little rain.
Rose Gidado is the Assistant Director at the National Biotechnology Development Agency in Nigeria. Sharp increases in extreme heat are a huge challenge for its largely rain-fed agriculture, and some even suggest food scarcity could fuel conflicts.
Because of the global warming, we have insects coming up, different insects that you never thought about, that you never experienced. Farmers are really bedeviled with some of these insects. And once they come, they eat off everything. The farmers incur losses up to 90%. And this challenge cannot be overcome by conventional breeding method. So it's only through the use of genetic modification technology or gene editing that this major challenge can be overcome.
In 2019, Nigeria approved the world's first genetically modified cowpea, also known as black-eyed pea, which was designed to be more insect and heat resistant. Rose Gidado says there are other projects in the pipeline designed to make food staples more nutritious.
Presently in Nigeria, we have the cassava variety that is being developed to have higher levels of vitamin A, iron and zinc. You're actually helping a lot in curbing malnutrition. Like here in Nigeria, 1,000 children die every day from the menace of malnutrition.
Back in London, I'm visiting Alara Whole Foods. In 1988, they were licensed by the Soil Association to produce the first organic certified cereal in the world. In the 90s, the founder and owner, Alex Smith, successfully campaigned against allowing GMOs into the UK market. But Alex feels that now the circumstances are very different.
We've absolutely got the opportunity now to move to a sustainable world. Food has to be at the forefront of that movement. Food is 1/3 of all climate change gas, and we need to incorporate the complexity, understanding the genome and using that genome into our systems.
What do you think is the key to unlocking this resistance if consumers are actually going to get behind it?
I'd say one of the things that this pandemic has done is it's really made heroes of those who have been developing the vaccines. Now, the vaccines that have been developed are using, very similar sorts of technologies. So linking those undoubted benefits of those technologies is certainly one way that this technology could seek to gain greater acceptance.
While Alex Smith may now view GMOs as an opportunity for humankind, many consumers and some campaigners across the world are still not convinced.
Hell no, GMO! Hell no, GMO!
Italian-based Marta Messa from the global slow food movement isn't just worried about the safety of the GMOs, but is particularly concerned about the implications of intellectual property rights behind some of the genetically engineered produce.
The problem we see with GMOs, it's really more who has the ownership of what we're cultivating and what we're eating. The 10 largest seed companies own 75% of the seed market globally. So there is a concentration of power that has a direct impact into what farmers and farming communities can decide to grow and cultivate. The issue of hunger and malnutrition often is not so much in terms of is there a product out there that is available or not, but is really more about who has access to land, who has access to seed, and who has access to food. You have the highest likelihood to achieve that level of food independence and food access if you develop food systems at the local level.
GMOWTO.
Yeah, and for labeling, what I'm really for is eradication. I would like to see no GMOs anywhere.
They are not tested enough for us to think that they're safe.
5 years ago, the National Academies of Sciences in the US released a comprehensive report into GMO's safety and environmental credentials. Professor of Agriculture Fred Gould was the committee chair.
There was no substantiated evidence that there were any harms caused by genetically engineered foods. Of course, we did find some positive effects in terms of health of farmers, because less pesticide is used in some genetically engineered crops, especially cotton.
Why do you think they have been so controversial, though?
And the idea that you're genetically engineering something and moving a gene from one species into another seems very unnatural, so maybe it could have caused harm. And that, in 1990s, that was an important question to ask. Now we have a lot more information. And that was coupled with the fact that the people who were doing this were large multinational corporations. And then, of course, it became very politicized. The media, in terms of calling them frankenfoods and things like that, we can actually test plants to test thousands of components of their molecules to figure out if something has changed that could be problematic. So I think sometimes we're stuck in the 1990s in terms of the way we think about genetic engineering.
The EU and the UK have recently started consultations on some of the newer genetic engineering techniques, like, for example, CRISPR, which involve editing a plant's genome without introducing genes from a different species. Some politicians believe this would be helpful in achieving Green Deal goals, while for others, these moves only revive old fears.
Question was asked in the House of Lords at one point about comments I had made about hoping to do human trials with the tomatoes. A prominent member of the House of Lords asked if I had breached the Nuremberg Convention. I think this is so outrageous, and the whole problem with all of this is that it's an obsession with the technology used to generate a trait. It's what you've done to it that's important.
Plant biologist Kathy Martin. While there appear to be great opportunities for humankind to use this technique wisely and for the benefit of all, Professor Fred Gould warns that GMOs are definitely not a silver bullet designed to cure all of our ailments.
We thought way back in the 1980s that we'd be able to increase the efficiency of photosynthesis. But that hasn't happened yet, and there's a big question about what are the promises of genetic engineering and what's going to actually be delivered.
Fred Gould, Professor of Agriculture at North Carolina University, ending that report by Ivana Davidovich. Peter, we heard in that report, didn't we, about some of the very differing views that still exist on GMOs. Japan, though, seems to be in the European camp where they feel that it's an area that we need to push further down on.
That's right. I feel a big difference between Japan and Europe on the one hand and the U.S. on the other hand in terms of attitudes about GMOs. And I think maybe even the Frankenfoods designation was more European one than one that was common in the U.S. Here in Japan, I would say if you tell somebody this is a GMO food and you put on the label in big letters, genetically altered or modified, that is an instant turnoff for many people. What they haven't noticed and probably don't notice is that maybe perhaps the cereal they're eating was made with grains that were genetically modified. So sometimes it's see no evil, hear no evil, and they don't know it and they don't want to know.
Alison, the thing is, though, we're probably going to see far more advancements in the area of food, isn't it, when we're talking about GMOs over the next decade or so. We've seen with vaccines how quickly things can move. We may well see that in food as well.
Yes, absolutely. And I think the reaction, especially in Europe and Japan, is there's a knee-jerk reaction against the big agriculture. It's more to do, as they explained, about the control of the seed market, this monopolistic thing, and it's almost Luddite. And I think the key part to put in bold caps is there are no documented ill effects to humans from GMOs. And that's, so it points to, there are conspiracy theories. It's almost like Luddite behavior, I feel.
It's such a big question, isn't it, Peter? We heard from Nigeria there, I spend a lot of time in India, where India is one of the countries that is at the forefront of the movement against GMOs because of what happened many, many years ago with seed production in parts of the country. But we need to develop our food, don't we, so that we can deal with the pest problems of Africa, so we can deal with providing more food to the rising population of Africa and Asia.
Yes, it was interesting to hear the campaigner there mention that her greater concern was the control of large corporations and less about the science or the dangers that a particular genetically modified food might pose to those eating that food. She was concerned about the structure of the industry and, antitrust law introduced into the food market. And so I agree that, having access to seeds it's not of any use to a farmer in India or Nigeria if there are great seeds that would produce a bigger crop, a safer crop, perhaps allow the use of less pesticides. If all of those great attributes of seeds are not available because the seeds themselves are too costly or controlled by corporations or whatever, that isn't an issue for developing nations. So it seems like a two-headed problem, you might say.
Alison, there you are in Silicon Valley, probably at the center of some of this change that we're seeing place. I mean, the tech companies are in every aspect of our lives, and they could be the driving force here when it comes to food.
Yes, in fact, they already have started. There are quite a few tech companies getting into what they call vertical farming. Companies like Plenty, they're doing, they're basically growing, making a controlled environment in a warehouse, salad, herbs are growing up walls with artificial lighting, but it just sounds very kind of 1984 or Brave New World in the worst sense. But if you think about, they use a lot less water. They can actually produce products without any pesticides whatsoever because it's an controlled environment. So there are upsides to it, and the consumers are liking that, but obviously it uses more energy because they're not using energy from the sun to grow. But there are all sorts of technologies, bubbling up because with, as your reporter pointed out, the livestock industry and the agriculture industry, they're responsible for a lot of our greenhouse gases. And so people in technology in Silicon Valley and beyond are looking at ways of preserving the water and making crops, produce more for a square foot of space. So that's why these vertical farming solutions are doing well. And the other issue, of course, is plant-based meat. That's another area where they can reduce the water use.
Yeah, huge area. Alison, thank you. Peter, are you off to the Olympics today?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Good. Enjoy. Hopefully we can see a great performance from Simone Biles. That is it for this edition of Business Matters. We'll be back same time, same place tomorrow.